C.P. Scott was famous for having said that facts was sacred, but comment was free. Actually, the truth is precisely the opposite. And the first thing about broadcasting impartiality is that it's impossible to defend because it doesn't exist. The problem of BBC impartiality was not that BBC reporters and presenters would step in front of the camera and say, vote Labour. It wasn't a question of people actually espousing a particular open political loyalties in public. It was that throughout the culture of the BBC, you caught on the edge of a remark, or you caught through the selection, or the arrangement, or the order of events, or the way in which persons were treated, or the tone of voice in which they were questioned, the fact that the BBC held a point of view, and that this was expressed most fundamentally through what I will call the presenterocracy. Those people who front all those programs, who are supposedly the embodiment of impartiality. When I go onto a BBC program, which does occasionally happen, what usually happens is that I am balanced, because I'm right-wing, by between 1 and 3 other people who disagree with me. And the discussion is then moderated by a presenter who always disagrees with me as well, and makes it plain in such actions as asking me, Peter Hitchens, do you seriously believe that? And this is supposed to be an impartial question. He thinks it's an impartial question. He doesn't know, as he does it, that he's giving anything away. I worked for a long time on the paper formerly known as the Daily Express. We don't mention it now because of its ownership, and I have no further connection with it. But at that time, unbelievably, I was a columnist sharing a page on different days with a person called Andrew Marr. Now, Andrew Marr, when he was a columnist for the Daily Express, was a thundering advocate of all kinds of left-wing policies, including British membership of the European single currency. In fact, he once devoted an entire column to attacking my views on this. Now, Andrew Marr is now an impartial commentator and interviewer on the impartial BBC. The BBC is not impartial. The BBC, as Mark Thompson has admitted, though only in respect to the past, is, of course, an organisation profoundly biased to the left. It recruits from the left, it's full of people on the left, from Balliol JCR to Golders Green Crematorium. None of them ever meets anybody they disagree with. That is the BBC. It's a lovely organisation. I favour its continued existence, and I don't think that I wish to join those who won't pay their licence fee or who demand that the airwaves in this country are handed to Mr. Murdoch, who has his own problems and with whom I have as many gripes as I have with the BBC, and I'm certainly not in any way here to advocate Fox News. The national broadcaster has a duty to reflect that there are different views in this country. And the simple way in which the national broadcaster can do this, and the way in which I've been urging for many, many, many years, and which seems to me to be straightforwardly obvious, is that in this country we have adversarial things which work. We have an adversarial parliament, or at least we did, until the parties all merged into one. We have adversarial trials, in which the defence and the prosecution conflict in front of a judge and an impartial jury. Why can we not have adversarial broadcasting? No left-wing politician should ever be interviewed by a left-wing presenter, and no right-wing politician ever interviewed by a right-wing presenter. You should always face the interrogation of an opponent, and that it should be clear that this is what is going on. We shouldn't pretend that these people are somehow impartial because they work for the BBC. This ludicrous, fatuous, untruthful pretense should be dropped, and that we should instead, on the main channels, accept that there are different views in this country, that not everybody in this country supports the centre-left, soft view adopted by the BBC, and that those who don't adopt that view deserve their turn in broadcasting, in national broadcasting, not on a ghetto channel, but where everybody will see it done.
If you do have polemical broadcasting of the kind which I think you want, don't you get something like the situation in the States? And by the situation in the States, I don't mean that you have a left-wing channel and a right-wing channel, indeed channels, but that you get a merging, a rather confusing merging, of media with politics, where the media seem actually to control at least the opinions of people more than the politicians do.
The media is already merged with politics. I would love, for instance, one day, with the aid of something rather more powerful than the Freedom of Information Act and with the reminiscences of people who are no longer playing, to examine the role of the BBC in rescuing the Conservative Party from what would otherwise have been total collapse under the leadership of Ian Duncan Smith. David Cameron could never have become leader of the Conservative Party without the support of the BBC. And he could never, David Cameron ran his campaign for leadership of the Conservative Party in the media. That's where it was run. And he had the endorsement because of many, many BBC journalists who believed at that time that the Conservative Party needed to be readmitted into what they regarded as civilised politics. That is to say, the politics of the centre-left. There's no question in my mind that the BBC was entirely committed as an organisation to intervening in the politics of the country, but not openly, not in a way that anybody could actually hold it to account for, but in this covert, sneaky way, which is hidden under impartiality. This is an organisation which claims that it is an act of impartiality to fire Melvyn Bragg as the presenter of Start the Week because they've suddenly discovered that he supports the Labour Party. It was a formalistic act, completely and utterly devoid of any real impact or importance, and of course that was reinforced by the fact he was promptly given the job presenting a programme remarkably similar to Start the Week elsewhere on Radio 4. There is no impartiality. If it's said, we are the BBC, we believe in these things, we have certain policies, we want this country to be more deeply integrated in the European Union, we don't believe in the punishment of criminals, we don't believe in selective education, we don't believe in certain aspects of foreign policy. If it said all these things, then that would be okay, but it doesn't. And what's more, it prevents people saying things on its channels which are opposed to those ideas, because they simply don't get a fair hearing.
I think in at least one thing Peter is right, and that is that the Conservatives did think that they had to suit themselves to the BBC, and Andrew Marr said in a meeting which was more or less public, the BBC is left liberal in its views. Not has been, but is. So that charge is probably right, isn't it, David?
Andrew Marr wrote that in his biography, his autobiography actually, his book about journalism. He wrote that two things. One, he wrote that the BBC had a metropolitan liberal attitude. That's what he wrote, and which isn't the same as saying there aren't any Conservatives in the BBC, because I think we've just supplied the press secretary to the Prime Minister and the press secretary to the Mayor of London within the last few years. So the idea that there's nobody of a different political persuasion than the BBC is utterly ludicrous. Well, let's get back to the real point, which is Peter's astonishing suggestion that on the Today programme and elsewhere we should have our people lining up behind particular political parties and doing interviews from that position. First off, you said there should be a left-wing interviewer and a right-wing interviewer. The right-wing interviewer should interview people from the left wing, and the left-wing interviewer should interview people from the right wing. First of all, it makes an astonishing claim about politics in this country today that you only have a left wing and a right wing. You know, we have a vast panoply and a growing panoply of political parties on all parts of the old and traditional political spectrum. Secondly, let's just give the British people a little bit of credit for intelligence about our political system. It's a bit daft to think that one of our presenters, before interviewing the leader of the Conservative Party, has to say, oh, by the way, I voted Labour at the last election, or vice versa, or by the way, I've always been a closet supporter of yours, or whatever it may be. It's an absurd suggestion.